Hi, this video is going to pick up where the last one left off and go just a little bit more in depth with issue questions, and then it's going to leave you off to write your own. And then you'll be using that issue question to use it as a tool as I go over the databases in a different screencast. So where we left off was that issue questions and the, are the kinds of questions that stimulate the writing that is most valued in college. They're open-ended questions that focus on unknowns or invite multiple points of view. Another way of thinking about this is that issue questions are ill-structured questions. And ill-structured questions are ones that don't have an easy answer. You can't just say 2 plus 2 equals 4. That would be a very well-structured question. Nobody's going to get a different answer. With ill-structured ones, it's more complex. You're going to have multiple points of view. It's usually embedded in something that's a real-world problem. It's not something abstract or theoretical. It's concrete, and it's usually kind of messy. And the reason you frame it as a question is so that it's open-ended, that you're looking for an objective answer to your question, as opposed to a biased or skewed kind of way of looking at it. So why the focus on issue questions? It's the kind of thing that I think drives how you become an expert in whatever field of study you're doing. It's not just an issue of getting to know all the facts in a discipline. You also have to know what the strongest, most thought-provoking questions are in a field. And then in that field, what are the different most prominent and strongest supported answers to those questions? So if you're studying something like philosophy and you're in philosophy of religion, maybe you'd be looking at a question of whether or not there's an afterlife. And there'll be different arguments arguing in different ways. There's no easy answer to those questions, but through the process of learning about the question and the different arguments on both sides, that's really how you come to be an expert in that field. Also, as you're doing research, you really need something to focus your research process, and an issue question will help you do that. As you're filtering through hundreds and hundreds of sources, it becomes a lot easier to know which sources you need and which don't. So if they're not directly related to your research question, you don't have to read it. And then if they are helping you address your question, then you might want to look further. It also keeps you focused on the problem itself. So by phrasing a question, you know exactly what it is you're trying to figure out. Sometimes problems are so messy that there's 10 or 12 different questions you could be asking, and framing just one question will help you keep focus on which piece of the problem you're working on. So they're also important because as you're gathering different points of view and different arguments that respond to your question, you'll most likely be gathering those articles and sources and different texts and books from a whole variety of different authors, different publications, different time periods, and that question will help pull everything together into a unified field. So if you have one question, then you can start to see connections across different articles that you're reading. And when we get there, we'll start calling that process of making those connections is synthesizing. It's putting your research together. And the thing that helps put it together is the fact that you have a question that you're trying to answer. So you can pull from the partial answers from each of your sources to help you answer more fully your own question. And questions are also a good way of keeping your biases and other people's biases in check. So because a question is just looking and asking for answers, it invites a range of perspectives, and then you get to see the whole gambit of views on an issue. Just by way of a few examples, a scientist might ask a question about how to predict flood patterns in mountain streams after wildfires. A friend of mine who's a government scientist is actually doing this kind of research, and this is a question that he's been working on for a number of years, and it's really complex, and other people study it and they publish it, and that the information that they gather through that process is useful for doing restoration work. So if a road gets washed out by a flood, their research helps determine how to rebuild that road and whether or not it should be, what size of culverts to put underneath the road. So that's just an example of how these issue questions might play out in a career. A literary issue question is going to be a little different. It might focus in on something like the human condition and what does Shakespeare tell us about it. And that's very broad. It would probably really focus in more on something like what does Shakespeare's play Hamlet tell us about the human condition, or even what does one question that Hamlet poses in one scene tell us about the human condition, and how does that compare with our own understanding in the 21st century. Philosophical questions, again, it's a different field of study. You might focus in on questions of the self. What is it? Does it survive death? Things like that. And by framing these questions, researching them, reading the arguments, you'd become to be something of an expert in this particular topic area in philosophy. And history is going to have its own sets of questions, and really every discipline is going to have we could call driving questions that are important fields of study and important sources of debate in a particular area. And what we want you to do for this assignment that we're going to be working on, and you'll be asked to write this down in the D2L quiz area after you finish the screencast, is I want you to write down a personal interest question. Just any kind of issue question that you want to ask, that's something that you are genuinely curious about. Because part of what I want to highlight is that library research isn't just good for academic work, it's also incredibly useful as just a means of gathering information about the world. And so the way we want to start off the next unit is by just having you practice doing some research into a question that you just would like more information about. For a few examples, here's some questions that I've looked into before, and some of the stuff, some of the directions that I've used library research that are mostly totally non-academic. But I've looked at how do I train for and run a marathon. And you can access studies into biology, there's physiological studies, there's all kinds of information about how to train and run marathons. And it's much more in-depth and more reliable than a lot of the stuff you'd find on the internet. One question I did when I was in college, which I thought was interesting at the time, but what effect does diet soda have on health? And even 10, 15 years ago, this was an interesting question, and there were already studies being published that had good information on this question. One that came up in class the other day, which I think is a fun one, but why do leaves change color in the fall? Just a curious, interesting question, and not as simple as you might think. What causes insomnia? So if you have a question that's more related to something that you personally would benefit from knowing the answer to it, it might help you sleep better. One I've asked before, and haven't done much with the answers that I found, but how do I grow a garden in Colorado's dry climate? So what we'd like you to do is think about what is it you'd like to know more about? What are you interested in? It could be something from class, could be something from one of your other classes, could just be something, a question you've always wanted to know more about, any kind of topic area. And we want you to write down that question, post it in D2L, and then that question will serve to help you work your way through gathering books, finding journal articles, finding magazine articles, and even working on improving your search skills in the library databases. So pick a question that you enjoy and that you're genuinely curious about, and feel free also if you need to change your question, that's okay. Really, we want you to figure out what it is you'd like to know and use the libraries to help you figure it out. So enjoy.